We made it.
Welcome to the Starlight Ballroom. Hey!
Hello and welcome to this special episode of Shipwrecked and Comatose. My name is Mark and I am just doing a quick intro before we repost something from the ChuckyVision feed. It is the 5th anniversary of our podcast network, that we made this podcast network, and across all of our podcasts this month we are posting crossovers, some of them tenuous, some of them less tenuous, some of them almost making sense. This one, kinda tenuous, but that's our style here on Shipwrecked and Comatose. This one is the second of 3 reposts from the ChuckyVision feed, where I had a guest host from Shipwrecked and Comatose joining me and my co-host on ChuckyVision, Dev Elson, to talk about an episode of telly with a doll in it. And this one really should be going on the X-Files feed. It might be going on the X-Files feed. I don't know. That's up to Tony, who runs the X-Cast. But Kurt joined me for a chat about an episode of the X-Files, Chinga. It's got a doll in it, which is relevant to ChuckyVision. Only thing relevant to Shipwrecked and Comatose is that we're both hosts here. We are going to try and post something a little bit more appropriate later on this month, but just out of curiosity, we thought you might like this too. So please do enjoy my chat with Kurt about killer dolls in the X-Files. Hello and welcome to ChuckyVision, the podcast about Chucky and Child's Play and things that are kind of sort of related to it here on the We Made This podcast network. My name's Mark Adams and I am your host for this one. And with me at this time, as always, most of the time, is Dev. Hello, Dev.
You held that over my head last time. Still holding it over my head.
I'm cracking the same gags, mate. I've only got one.
I'm here, though. I'm here this time.
And you still hate love because you don't like Heartstopper. But we've not just got me and Dev today. We've got Kurt North. Hello, Kurt.
Hello. How are you?
I'm good. And you are my co-host on Shipwrecked and Comatose, and also the host of probably the most successful podcast in the world, the X-Cast.
I'm the host of the second most important podcast in the world, Make It So, a Star Trek Legacy podcast. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I'm in the top 2. Although I got knocked out recently.
All 3 of those shows do better than ChuckyVision. So we have got a real celebrity on board today.
It's not about the numbers, mate. It's the quality that counts.
That's true. We are very, very good at being the only Chucky podcast that's consistent. As in, consistently put stuff out there, not consistently good. So it's this. Let's have you on. Do you watch Chucky films in any way, shape, or form?
No.
And we won't ask you our Chucky questions. We'll go straight on to our topic of today, which is an episode of The X-Files, which has an evil doll in it. This is the second of our 3-part, originally 2-part, but now 3-part series, where we're looking at cult TV shows that have a episode with a doll on. And who better than the host of The X-Cast to talk about the one that's on The X-Files?
Why, thank you.
So, Dev, what is your engagement with The X-Files?
I love it. I love the show. I started it in uni. I started it at an inopportune and an opportune time because I watched up to about season, I think it was 6. I got just starting season 6 and I was watching it on standard def DVDs. And then that was exactly when they came out of the HD versions. And when I was so impressed by those, I just started from the start, just watched the show again. So I've seen The X-Files 1.5 times.
For me, it was something that was always there and always around, a really famous telly show, but because I didn't have Sky, I kind of missed it. And then by the time I blinked and thought about it, there were 10 series of it or whatever. I just never watched it. Do you remember when DVDs just became super ridiculously cheap? Almost overnight, you would pay £90 for one series of Buffy, and then a few years later, you could pay 50 quid for all 7 series of Buffy. When that happened, I got the entire X-Files for 50 quid and just binged it all once. And I've never watched it again since. Loved it, though.
Nice.
It was genuinely lots of fun, and I think it's a great series. I never loved it, never engaged with its cult status, but, you know, bit of a geek polymath thing. You got to watch everything once, and I really liked it. Whereas, Kurt, tell me why The X-Files is the show for you.
Well, I mean, I can maybe expand a little bit on why I'm not particularly thinking of Chucky and things as well in relation to this, because it was on 1992, 1993 was the first pilot. The episode was shown in 1992. It got released in 1993. I came to it in the second season, so I was about 14 at the time. So I was quite impressionist at that point, taking in the content that I was taking in. And that show, along with Star Trek Next Generation, were the two shows that I watched at the time. I remember vividly the first scene that I saw, and then I was like kind of fixated with that. And what I found with like Star Trek Next Generation and X-Files, similar to what you're saying with the videos things, that the seasons themselves were about £120 when I first bought the first one. I think it was £126. Yeah. They'd gone down to about £80 by the time you got into like the later seasons. And then obviously, as you say, price drops on Buffy and all kinds of things in like the HMV stores and our prices of the world. The thing that kind of got me with the X-Files and both the X-Files and Star Trek is that they would release TV movies or VHSs of particular episodes rather than actually 2 episodes here, 2 episodes there for a continuation, as if you like they did do that, but you'd have like a special feature with like 3 episodes put together as if it's a movie. So doing like 2-hour 10 movie. The second one was like 2 episodes put together, but it's Eugene Victor Toombs, who was played by Doug Hutchinson, you know, so there's like that became really kind of secured in cult with that particular monster. And then as I got Sky and the like, it was like basically week in, week out, and I just became absolutely fascinated with it. And it was just one thing after another. Then they released another show called Millennium in 1996, which is very dark, starring Lance Henriksen, which was more of a serial killer of the week, which had some end of the world, end times, religious kind of Seven. It was kind of like a Seven kind of style. The concept, the genre that they were playing in just absolutely worked for me. It had a lovely mix, the X-Files, of humorous episodes, but it also had like sort of mythology, which I was mainly involved in. And it was a show that kind of pushed the envelope. You know, things like Lost would come out in 2004, which continued on the kind of serialization. Deep Space Nine did it. So those type of things. And, you know, it had loads of copycats as well, like the First Wave, Dark Skies that came out in the 90s. So it just was one of those things. It was a cultural moment in the 90s, and people forget how big that show was because, you know, they were front of magazines and all kinds in the 90s, and it was the show to be in. And it was one of those ones that has a continuation since 30th year this year. You know, next month is its 30th anniversary. And as you say, it's 10, 11 seasons. You know, that was back in 2016, 2018. So it has that longevity, it has a good fan base. It just was seeped into my bones, really. And when I talk about the Chucky stuff, it's the X-Files kind of coloured me in a lot of ways. I'm not a huge horror fan in general, but I do like horror elements. So like I still, in my head, even though I know I'm wrong, I don't think The Thing is a horror movie. I think of it as a sci-fi movie. I completely look at that as something like that. And X-Files did an episode called Ice, which was basically a rip-off of The Thing. But but that kind of thing is like, for me, it's more of there's more to it. That there's a groundedness of the X-Files. It was in reality, but it was hyper real and stuff like that, which I quite like. To love the procedural element along with the fantastical element of it as well. So I think that kind of really calls to me, and it'll be interesting when we talk about this episode coming up about some of my concerns with this particular episode and the X-Files as it gets into later seasons.
Have you never watched a Chucky film at all?
I've got a vague recollection of maybe seeing bits of one, but not to that degree. No, horror's never been something that I've been really showcased. It's never been showcased in my house when I was growing up. There wasn't anything like that. And this is going to sound horrible, but even like sort of The Shining, I only saw The Shining recently and I didn't like it. I just didn't.
What?
I just did not like it. It just didn't do anything for me at all. So although it has got some elements I did quite enjoy, my horror is something like Eraserhead by David Lynch. That is my epitome of horror. That is the thing that scares me the most. And has been since I saw that film. But I tend to like more of the psychological thrillers and your sci-fi elements more than I do that kind of side of it. But I do like having the horror elements stapled within those type of shows.
Being brutally honest about Child's Play, if you want an example of a very, very good, well done slasher, you've got the classics. But also, I would say Child's Play is probably my favourite slasher film. It is brilliant. People don't realise how influential Bride of Chucky was for the kind of postmodern, ironic elements of horror. And as a historical piece, and also because it's my favourite of all the fucking Chuckies. The rest of them are great, but I'd say those two are the ones you should probably watch. Would you agree with that, Dev?
Yeah, I definitely say with your approach to horror, Kurt, I'd probably recommend, Bride of Chucky, because the horror is more violence and it's a comedy. It's very meta, like Scream. The first Child's Play, I don't know if you'd enjoy it, but like that isn't just Chucky's got a knife and he's going around killing people. It's a reveal. It's like halfway, 45 minutes into the film when you actually see Chucky, walking and talking. So, I mean, that is a different kind of horror than the later films.
I think just with you saying that and the way that I would approach it is I like my psychological stuff. You've got more of that element to it. I have more of an inkling to that, but something meta's quite good as well.
The X-Files does have quite a nice balance of horror and sci-fi. And you're absolutely right. Horror and sci-fi as a combo are just fantastic bedfellows. They always have been. Gory science fiction action films in the 80s were one of my very favourite things, where you just didn't need it to be as gory as it was. But fuck it, it's the 80s. And I love stuff like that. I absolutely love stuff like that. So, yeah, I think sci-fi and horror really do well together.
I'd attest to something like Event Horizon as well. Those type of movies are what kind of throw me in. The sci-fi draws me in and it becomes a horror. It naturally feels like, oh, right, I'm in a horror now, rather than actually seeking out something. And slasher movies just don't really do that for me. They don't have that hook that I need to get into it. But I went to Event Horizon not knowing anything about it and then going, oh dear, okay. So that was definitely intriguing. But the sci-fi and the horror together, I think, is where I would normally focus more on.
Unfortunately, there isn't an 8th Chucky film, Chucky in Space. So, we did have Leprechaun in space. We had Jason X, Jason Voorhees ended up in space, and I won't have a bad word said about that film. It's fucking great.
Another X-Files, which is pure horror, is the X-File episode Home, if you remember.
Oh, God,
Home, with the Peacock family. I've had the pleasure of speaking to the woman who was under the bed a few times, Karen Carnival. She also plays the orangutan in Planet of the Apes. She's really, really an interesting woman to speak to, and she absolutely adores that role as the woman under the bed in Home. But the use of music in Home is another prime example of how to make things really unnerving. And but that actually in America didn't actually was only shown once for a long, long time because it was kind of given an MAA rating. So the fact that it was that horrific. And then the show, as I say, the spin-off Millennium, they wanted to bring the Peacock family back, and the censors went, no way in hell's chance of you bringing that family back on TV.
Really?
So, yeah.
Good grief.
Yeah.
All right, so shall we talk about the X-Files episode featuring an evil doll?
Did you bring up The Shining on purpose? This episode is written by Stephen King.
I might have done. we'll definitely get into that. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So as guest writers go, you can't really get much bigger than Stephen King. This episode was Series 5, Episode 10, and it was called Chinga in the States. But when it came over to the UK, they discovered that Chinga is a Mexican swear word. It basically means fuck. And so they changed it to Bung Honey, which is a crap name. It was released in February 1998, which means it was just a few months earlier than the release of Bride of Chucky. So similarly to the episode of Buffy we looked at, we've only seen Child's Play 2, and Child's Play 3 at this point. It doesn't really feel like the classic format of the X-Files because the protagonists aren't together at any point. Kurt, can you give us any insight into why they basically did it this way? Why it was it like, in Doctor Who where they have the Dr. Light episode? Did David Duchovny need a holiday?
Season 4 and Season 5 are an interesting moment in X-Files history. Chris Carter, the creator, was in the middle of releasing Millennium, because Millennium came out in 96. So this was late 97. The movie's just around the corner. Fight the Future, the X-Files movie, came out in 1998, August 1998. there has been in season 4 and season 5 episodes where Mulder and Scully have been separated, or they haven't been in at all, or appeared once or twice because they were doing reshoots or filming bits for the movie. The likes of David Duchovny in season 6, for example, wrote an episode, but because he was busy writing and directing that episode, he didn't appear in the following one because he needed time to do it. So there's a little bit of that going on. But apparently the Stephen King element was the fact that he actually wrote them together, and it was Chris Carter that actually split them up and said, actually, it'd be better if we can kind of split them up and focus more on Scully. Whether or not there was, I don't think there was anything to do with the movie around this time. The general consensus for I think it was season 2 or 3, Chris Carter was noted that even though everyone has a writing credit, so you get like a writing credit from Darren Morgan or, whoever might be writing that episode, Chris Carter's hands are all over it as the author, so he would be rewriting stuff, and I think he wrote 24 out of or rewrote parts of 24 of the 25 episodes that released that season. When they looked at the script and looked at how the look of obviously an hour's television, 45-minute television show, Stephen King's adaptation, his screenplay on it, would have been an absolutely obnoxious kind of thing to be able to pull together in 1 hour. So there was a lot of not reshooting, but rewriting. Mulder and Scully didn't seem the same characters because he doesn't really have the breadth of knowledge over the 5 seasons. So Chris Carter, and he's even said himself, was happy for Stephen King just to be on the title credits himself. But Stephen King actually said, look, you need to be on the title credits with me. So it was a Stephen King and Chris Carter show. And it was actually Chris Carter. And he's been known to do that a few times by splitting them up. You're able to do different things with them. And obviously this one, you've got to bear in mind some of the stuff that's predated this episode. So there's a lot. Darren Mooney's a well-known writer and he's with the Escapist magazine now, but he's written a book on the X-Files. He kind of alludes to the fact that one of the women in this, called Melissa, is actually the same name as Scully's sister. And there's a lot of story elements that are kind of linked in with something that happened earlier in the season in relation to her sister, only like 5 or 6 episodes ago. So there's a bit of mirroring happening there as well, which is kind of under the line. So yes, the short story is that Chris Carter's had a bit of a rewrite, and Kim Manners, the director's also been involved.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I wouldn't have spotted that link at all. I haven't seen the X-Files in about 10 or 15 years. I just wanted to kill a doll, which is what I got. But it starts with a cold open, which is genuinely very creepy. I really liked the cold open, the doll's eyes, let's have fun, I want to play. It's all very child's play. It's all borderline plagiarism, to be honest with you. It's done really well.
X-Files was renowned for cold opens. The opening for a lot of shows were really, really good. Kim Manners, the director, especially, was renowned for some of his interpersonal stuff with Mulder and Scully, but he is really good at the horror. He's got a really good eye for directing horror. So the fact that he's been brought on to do this episode is no surprise in my eyes.
Then we have the X-Files theme, which I feel like I have to mention. One of my favourite films of all time. Dev is giggling but also shaking his head. So the X-Files theme is written by Mark Snow. He cut his chops on one of the best films in all of ever. I won't have a bad word said against it. Dolly Dearest. Dolly Dearest had Tasha Yar in it. I know you like Star Trek.
Denise Crosby. Okay.
Yeah, Tasha Yar was the mom. It's just the best. It's like the second best evil doll film of all time. It's not. It's a bit crap. But it had a soundtrack that it didn't deserve because it was written by Mark Snow really, really early on.
Right.
And so you just have the kind of like weirdly good soundtrack to a kind of film. Watch Dolly Dearest, everybody. It's great. And then listen to our episode on Dolly Dearest and see how much I love it, because I love it.
Brilliant.
But it's a fucking iconic theme. Genuinely sublime television theme. It's got to be up there as one of the best theme tunes of all time. Top 10, maybe even top 5.
It's interesting watching people call it, I think it's the Illuminati song now on TikTok and the like, because they don't know it's from the X-Files, and they say, that's the Illuminati song. It's like, yeah.
The X-Files is that old now. Fuck.
Yep, 30 years.
Damn. So the X-Files is a sci-fi show. Like we talked about really early on, it is that this is clearly a deliberate horror sci-fi. I don't feel like there's really any sci-fi in this, though. It feels much more supernatural horror rather than sci-fi in a kind of sci-fi themed TV show. Would you both say that that's fair?
Yeah, definitely. There's no science in this, really. Though, ironically, I guess part of the humor is Mulder does keep phoning up with more reasonable explanations, and it's Scully being the one who's like, actually, this may be a haunted doll.
yeah. It's and the end of the episode does that, because obviously with Scully saying, "I just needed to get on my head for a few days," it's kind of alluding to that flippy floppy thing. As I say, what I was alluding to before was exactly that. So a lot of the it's not always the case, but a lot of the X-Files, obviously, it's an elastic show, so it can do your really horrific, funny episodes. You can have your sci-fi stuff. It's not hard sci-fi a lot of the times. It's kind of, it looks for explanation of things and then makes that hyper real. So when it does try and do sci-fi, there's an episode called First Person Shoot, which is absolutely horrific, and it's written by the one of the big cyberpunk guys. Can't remember what his name is now. The writer.
Do you mean William Gibson?
I do. I'll just check that, because he's written two. He wrote an episode called Kill Switch, which isn't a bad episode, which is about AI, and First Person Shooter's more about a computer game. It's kind of like a holodeck. It's not good. It is, but it's not. X-Files doesn't suit it. Because it's too sci-fi. It's not your sci-fi channel kind of show. You know what I mean? Because it is grounded. Because it, like I said, with the procedural element to it, it has to have some basis in science, because Scully needs to hold on to that. Later we're in 5 seasons here, you're starting to see, not necessarily with the cracks, because they have episodes like this, but you're starting to see more episodes like this as you get into the show, where there isn't really an explanation, but come the end of it, X-Files never gives explanations. It always leaves an open-ended question, but there's generally some science that is an argument between Mulder and Scully. Like you said, Mark, earlier, they're not together. They are talking on the phone, and they are having the conversations, which is great to see. And that's part of what makes X-Files good. But there's no real scientific thing that Scully's latching onto, or in this case, Mulder's latching onto, to go, it could be this, it could be that. There's an earlier episode in season 3 called War of the Cottagers, where they do the same thing. We're on the phone, but then Scully's just like being bored at home and washing the dishes and stuff, and she's on the phone going, "Have you checked the eyes?" Yeah, common thing, nature of that is heart attacks from anaphylactic shock. If you see that the eyes are dilated, blah, 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 and there's an explanation for it. But that's starting to lose it, and especially with a Stephen King story, you can see why that happens.
So a couple of responses to this. One is flippant, one is actually, one isn't. The first one, fucking hell, Stephen King, William Gibson, has Jane Austen written for the X-Files? The other one is a bit more serious. Because it's series 5, X-Files has got a few, not cracks, but you know what I'm saying. Whereas the relationship between Mulder and Scully, we see 2, maybe 3 minutes of them talking together as a max. The chemistry, the way they work, the relationship, they fucking hell just have sex of it all is so perfect. The actors have got it so right, and it's developed to this point, and it is really beautiful and really, really well done in this episode. And they're on the phone. It's great. And credit to the actors for that.
The way that they have done that over the time, as you say, it's over the phone. I mean, the X-Files was at the time when mobiles were starting to come in. So it was the first mobile show.
Oh, that gigantic mobile.
Yeah, so but it was the first show that you kind of have that contemporary style of actually you can use the phone and use it often. If I was being a little bit critical, there is moments in Mulder's psyche, because Mulder wouldn't get bored. He'd be doing something. He would be going out and trying to do what Scully's doing. So there is a little bit of like, would he really do that? It's not the first time that's happened. He's went to Graceland in last season, so it's not the end of the world, but he's not as fully formed here than he would be back in season 1. But then the question is, what is he like without Scully? And that's another element to it as well. And David Duchovny, this with his comedic chops are brilliant. This is when you really start to feel this Californication stuff coming in.
Another element of this that it does really, really well, and it's something that as a British person, I find particularly creepy. Your small town Americans with the strong accents and the kind of hick attitudes. I know it's a massive trope. It always manages to freak me, maybe more than any kind of macabre, brutal horror would. These kind of genuinely frightening insular people And I think this episode does that really, really well. To the point, like, are these bad actors who've done it by mistake, or are they really good actors that creep me the fuck out?
It's really a 1-2 punch in this episode of X-Files, which does that because they're all across the country finding these weird towns. And then, of course, Stephen King. Because there's so many Maine. This is in Maine, and it's so on the nose that Scully literally wears a Maine shirt. Like for the first 10 minutes, Maine is always on just the verge of destruction in Stephen King stories.
What I like about that from an X-Files perspective is that she's wearing that T-shirt, but when she goes in to investigate the shop, which again is kind of an allusion to an earlier season, but she puts the jacket on. So it's almost like get to work time. She just puts like a blazer on. It's like, right, she's going into Scully mode, which I find quite good.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely power in outfits. A friend of mine is a wrestling commentator, and we did some wrestling commentary post-production in my living room. And she was like, I know this is ridiculous, but I'm going to put my jacket on and I'm going to put on my perfume because that's what I do before a live show. My friend SoCal Val, she's famous. Just so you know. Okay. But no, there's absolutely power in clothing. Just little subtle things like that you might not spot unless you do that kind of thing yourself.
Yeah, I would actually agree with that. Yeah, especially for playing in a band for 25 years, getting yourself ready. You know what I mean? It's like not necessarily building yourself up, but when you're getting ready to go on stage and you're dressed ready for it, it does make a difference. Continuing
on with the creepy small town Americans, holy fuck, buddy, holy fuck, that man is like the epitome of incel modern cunt. It's almost ahead of its time. This man seems to think it's perfectly okay that he can buy a woman. They want that. And I quite like when characters are that cunty.
Yeah, I mean, the whole episode focuses, I mean, it must be a Stephen King thing a little bit, I think. Witchcraft is mentioned. Whore at one point is mentioned about her as well. The fact that she's a single mother, and obviously the fact that the husband had died. And they have this, she's witchcraft, she's a whore, she's this, she's that. And there's this thing of like, she's just sleeping around with everyone, the butcher at the beginning. And the mother's just kind of going, well, we did kind of see each other, but we weren't really like exclusive right at the moment, kind of story about maybe just them developing that. And then you've got Buddy, as you say, almost insidious kind of like infatuation, unrequited. It does feel like it's in that wheelhouse. That's, as you say, that small town mentality of like just focusing on that witchcrafty stuff.
Yeah, when you mentioned the range of topics that X-Files could cover, just this episode where you think X-Files, you think aliens, but this episode is covering like witchcraft. They throw in autism at one point, that kind of quasi-science that X-Files usually, that realism science, which doesn't really go anywhere. I think it's only mentioned in one scene. And then, just the whole haunted doll thing, which is never really attached to witchcraft at all. It seems a completely separate thing.
I never want TV. I never want shows or films to actually tell me the story. I'd rather them just leave me with a question and I'll make up my own mind. This one almost feels like it wants to go down the route. And I think Stephen King does this a lot in his thing. He generally has like mentally ill people that might have supernatural powers as such, the way that he portrays that. But the autism thing's mentioned, not really mentioned again. In a normal X-File episode, you might get Mulder and Scully bashing on about if they were together in the room. Mulder might have a theory that that there's some sort of curse on the doll, which is making the door to go through the doll to make things happen. But you have to kind of infer that, and it has to be quite a strong inference to do it. And they don't have the debate about whether or not that is, or is it the doll itself? Is it just that the two of them together has created this thing? There's not really that kind of debate happening because Mulder's out the equation and is only shooting in from the sidelines, which I think does suffer the episode a little bit because you're not getting that the Mulder and Scully dynamic actually battering heads together about what it could be.
The ending, especially, is pretty much unresolved. Like, they get rid of the doll. As funny as that last scene with Mulder and Scully is, they don't discuss what happened at all. And we don't really know what happened at the end.
No. But that's classic horror, isn't it? And there is a huge, huge amount of horror tropes in here. In fact, I've written them all down. I've got busybody, evil kid, struggling mum, local cop, not being believed, bad guy coming back at the end. Have either of you got any more horror tropes that we saw in this 42-minute episode?
Well, I've mentioned witchcraft already.
Yeah, no explanation.
The music, hokey cokey. Everyone call it hokey cokey because Americans don't. It's hokey pokey.
Is it?
Yes, because our coverage of this episode was with two women called Sarah and Clara. Clara's English and Sarah's American, and they both had this conversation about the hokey pokey or the hokey cokey. I'm going with the black lace number, the hokey cokey, personally, but there you go. That trope for me it doesn't work as effectively. Something like the X-Files Home episode, Wonderful, Wonderful, which is a kind of it's a cover, but it's done in the same style as Johnny Mathis, because Johnny Mathis couldn't get the rights for the Johnny Mathis song. So they had someone, a sounder like, actually record it. And that's the reason why, one of the reasons why Home is so great. There's one scene where that song is playing over the events that's happening, and it is just ridiculously good. And you get shows that do it for, not even for horror movies, like in Lost, they do a really interesting dynamic with an old song. But that's a trope, using like a really happy song for something that's quite unnerving and insidious.
And talking about those tropes, I mentioned the busybody. There's few things that I like more in a horror film than the busybody having a hideous death. And this episode delivered. I was fucking delighted that bitch got what was coming to her.
Yeah, she really reminded me of, I can't remember her name, the woman in the mist.
Yes.
The really religious woman in that.
Yeah.
King will always make someone who's fairly religious and just, as you say, a real busybody, and they just get what's coming to them.
So, see, that bit for me, just a little bit too corny for me. Because the way she was holding the vinyl and like this, and I was like, oh, I'm not sure I quite like that.
It's probably one of the strongest King parts of the script.
I can see X-Files have done it quite a few times, so it was all right.
Also, she's not half wrong. It was to do with the mother and child, and that did steer Scully in the right way.
That's actually interesting because my very next note after that was Scully's a really good detective. When Batman, you actually get him being a good detective and you're like, shit, he's supposed to be a good detective. This was really good detective work. I felt like that was actually a really nice thing to do in this episode, was to just gently highlight that she's good at her job, actually. Even though she hasn't got a clue about the supernatural element, she's a great detective.
Well, there's a reason why there's a Dana Scully effect in the 90s, because everyone wanted to be an FBI agent because of her, because of Gillian Anderson's portrayal of her. And it's because of that, because of just how direct and kind of like, she was willing to argue her case. She's based on Clarice Starr at the end of the day. Silence of the Lambs is a massive influence on the X-Files. That whole concept of that strong, powerful person in law enforcement and Scully being that is, and again, it goes back to that whole thing, like people just won't know that nowadays, but that was such a strong case. The Scully effect was massive in the late 90s, really was.
As much as I do love Scully, I absolutely love Scully, and she doesn't do anything wrong in this episode. In this episode, it is a case of, there was literally a scene where she's talking to the police and she's like, we should talk to Melissa because everyone keeps mentioning Melissa, and he's just like, why would he talk to her? Why not? She definitely seems suspicious. This seems to be circling around her.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that might be just I think the character's name was Bond Saint, something like that.
Bond Saint, yeah.
And I think that was just to highlight the difference in ability and capability. Yeah. And I like that this is a strong female character. You've got to remember, this is only 98. Let's put it into comparison with something Kurt might know. In 1998... holy crap, some of the stuff we saw on Red Dwarf was not as positive about this, the way they treated Kachansky.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Bond fan, I've actually spoken to, and in person and over a podcast with Larry Musser, who plays that character. And he said quite a few things about this episode when I spoke to him. The idea of him as a character, they are aware of this happening, but they're just not willing to do anything about it. They're kind of just, okay. I mean, that wasn't what he said. That was just coming from me. But there is an element of like, they know something's amiss, but they're just kind of going, well, we're just a small town. We don't want to really like rock the trees as such. And
I get the vibe, yeah.
Yeah, and he does come, and he does feel like, and like the end of the episode kind of portrays, it should have been a bit stronger, this, is that when we get the poster, the I Want to Believe poster where Scully's going, I might want to give it to somebody, it's because he starts off at the beginning kind of like making those little comments and then just backing off from it. And then, and Mulder and Scully and Bonfant have this kind of communication between each other, which I feel like could have been stronger, because I thought it was good. Larry Mussel's a very good actor, and he actually appears in my favorite episode of the X-Files of all time, as Detective Manners, which is ironic because Kim Manners actually directs this one. As he plays a cop in that as well, where they just bleep him out all the time when he swears, which is fantastic. But he bleeps himself out, so he goes like, "I don't think you bleakety bleep blank hole." Just does that, or just talks it. It's brilliant. It's so funny. But yeah, he said like sort of, the fact that it was nice to play off Gillian for that reason. She's just a power horse on it. It's just amazing to see her in that position. But he is playing that kind of cop. It's just, he's there and thereabouts. He just isn't willing to take that extra dive.
So there's a line that absolutely popped me. Can you guess what it was and who said it?
Oh, Mulder mentions. You mean like Chucky?
I wasn't ready. I
was wondering if you're gonna like mention that,
like a direct reference to Chucky. I was like, like threw my arms up in the air and stuff. I love that this is written by Stephen King, and my favorite horror of all time is clearly acknowledged quite strongly by one of the greatest horror writers of all time. But also mentioning Chucky directly in a episode about an evil doll by the guy who's supposed to be the supernatural guy, that's pretty fucking meta. As much as The X-Files is a show that takes itself quite seriously, this moment, it threw me because it wasn't.
When they are on top form, there's an episode called Bad Blood, which is considered one of the best episodes ever. It was written by somebody called Vince Gilligan. I don't know if you've heard of him. So Vince writes his Bad Blood, and it's about vampires, and X-Files doesn't really do vampires very well. There's an episode called 3, which isn't great. I quite enjoy it, but a lot of people hate it. But it's done in a Rashomon kind of a style where it's point of view, and it is absolutely hilarious. And when you get to season 4, season 5, and then season 6 becomes what a lot of people say is X-Files light, you do have this humor, you do have this kind of feel to it, and some of the moments actually becomes a much lighter show, but it's the way they deliver it. Whereas like earlier in season 2 had some funny moments and they had funny episodes, but they've completely got their mojo working by the time they get to season 4 and season 5, and maybe it suffers a little bit. I think my favourite moments of this episode actually is the Mulder and Scully bits, and they're just really funny and really good, and it's just them two playing off each other. But it's tonally a bit weird because you get from dark to like light to like then something slightly different. And I do feel that tonally it does shift to a little bit too much.
Kind of similar, weirdly, in a way with the Buffy episode we looked at. And we talked a bit about that. I wouldn't skip either of these, but we talked about like skippable episodes, non-important episodes. We talked about there'd always be one important scene that's kind of serialized or character important that you've got to watch. The Buffy one, there was a lot of good character comedy in it. And it's similar to this one, a lot of good character comedy, like some really strong Mulder and Scully moments, and some ones that become running gags as well, like the pencils in the ceiling and stuff.
Yeah.
Like these become character-defining moments, and it's in an episode like this.
Was this the first example of the pencils in the ceiling?
Yes.
Apparently, yeah.
Yeah, this is where it came from.
Okay. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
See, this is why killer dolls are so important.
Even in Red Dwarf 10. Oh, my God. You can tell I want to get on Red Dwarf 10, Mark. You need to watch it. We're only a couple of weeks away.
Yeah.
Is that in Series 10 of The X-Files, when they come back and they go back to the basement, they look up and the pencils are still there.
Brilliant.
Yeah, it's just like a lovely, lovely touch.
And we did talk briefly about how good the soundtrack to Dolly Dearest is, written by Mark Snow. And Dolly Dearest is one of the greatest films of all time. But as horror soundtracks go, particularly towards the end, as it kind of builds up to the oh shit moments, the soundtrack to this episode is great. I didn't look it up this time. Is it someone super? Is it Mark Snow or is
Mark
it somebody
Snow
else?
does the entirety of
Mark Snow, yeah.
the entirety of the show. There's not. I don't think there's even one episode where he doesn't do.
Right.
It's the same
well,
because
that makes a lot of sense then.
He does Supernatural as well. Does Mark Snow? So if you would see that in Supernatural. Personally, I haven't actually seen the show, but you'll see a lot of actors because it's Vancouver based, and a lot of the crew. You could watch Supernatural and just see a scene of it. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you might not be able to work out if it's X-Files or Supernatural. It's just the actual lot of the crew, and actually still stayed and did that show.
Yeah, I don't know if you know, Kat, but since you brought him up, there's another cop character on Supernatural. I don't know if it's Detective Manners, but it's like Sheriff Manners.
Yeah, I'm sure Kim Manners.
Kim Manners did a lot of Supernatural.
Yeah.
Shall we actually talk about the doll herself? As creepy dolls go, I want to play is pushing it, because want to play is clearly a catchphrase from Chucky. I think they then mention Chucky, which kind of like makes me okay with it again. But the voice, great. The eyes, creepy as fuck. Don't play with matches. Let's have fun. I think it's really well done.
I don't like you anymore.
Yeah, it's creepy as fuck. And that's what you've got to do with dolls, because they're so small and kind of fragile. You've got to eke up the creep to make it work.
So what did you make to the life-size doll moments that you get? You know, it's when you get the vinyl being stabbed into the woman, and you also see some of the sheets and stuff. We actually see more of a life-size version of the doll. It's those type of things that I mean, it's a disembodiment, but those type of things I struggle with. That's the kind of thing that I'm not as au fait with or comfortable with, because it's kind of like, if there was like a conjuring of some sort, then I can kind of get behind it, but it just seems to just happen. But there's no real connection as such, where it's like you've got the doll actually as the doll, and it's opening its eyes and things happen, almost like astral projection-y type stuff or telekinesis or whatever. But then you get this other element with this larger doll. So what do you make to that?
Yeah, I guess it was a weird little additional thing. That was a thing I didn't pick up on when I was reading the trivia and stuff on the doll, that the art direction behind it, how it was like a Frankenstein doll in a sense, that they were putting all these different parts of different dolls together. And it was meant to have like a really big head. I don't know. Did it really stand out as remarkable to you guys? It just kind of looked like a normal doll to me.
Definitely just a normal doll. Creepy doll, but a normal doll, not a wrong proportions doll, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's more, it's where I kind of struggle with, like, in my head, it might be a perception that I've got wrong, but in my head, that's the type of thing that I struggle with horror. It's like, there's no real kind of concept underneath it. It's more just for the scare. And I'm not really that, I need something more tangible to actually latch onto, to even think about it. I'm more than happy to do the X-Files thing and go, well, actually, the doll is projecting somehow, but there's no discussion about how that doll projects. And you've now got a 6-foot doll, which you only see briefly, you know what I mean? You only see it very briefly or through the window. But then there's also the added element that the mother, and this is maybe where the draft is coming in, because if it was like an hour and a half screenplay and they've had to put it down to 45 minutes, the mother seems to have some sort of psychic ability, because she can see people dying before that happens. That happens in X-Files all the time. There's not really any element to it apart from maybe the witchcraft mention. So it's almost like stuff's been cut out that we're not privy to. Yeah,
I remember when the episode with the cold opening started, I didn't think that this was going to reference Chucky. I was thinking of two like classic episodes, like from the Twilight Zone. I was thinking of Living Doll. They don't know if the doll is alive or not. And then there's another one called It's a Good Life. A little boy has like the powers of reality. The little girl reminded me of that boy.
Yeah.
He gets really angry if he doesn't get his way. If she, like the girl when she doesn't get her cherries in the ice cream parlor. And when they get angry, reality warps around them. It's kind of unclear what the magic is, because like people are like clawing their own eyes out. The woman gets her hair telekinetically pulled into the ice cream thing. We get 2 cases of people killing themselves. Yeah, you don't quite know what the doll is going to do next.
I think that's the problem. It's the cohesion for me, where it's like in previous episodes, you'd have very much like the soldier who's a quadruple amputee is astral projecting, and it's more like an astral projection of someone, and actually is killing people and there's a horrific death where they cover a young kid in sand and the kid dies. But then you get a scene where they're in the swimming pool and this woman's swimming, and you can see this thing behind it, just this shadow. It's very clearly defined where Mulder's going, I think it's astral projection, I think it's him. And Scully going, well, how can it possibly be him? And there's a clear delineation between the argument of, that story. This feels like there's meshes of everything. Now, if Mulder was there, you might get like multiple theories on what it could be, or I think she's going through the doll and there's an apparition happening, or there's telekinesis through the doll or whatever. You get none of that, but then there's disparate things happening with the mother, with the doll, with her, with telekinesis, there's this, there's that.
There is a difference between sci-fi horror and sci-fi horror. You're used to sci-fi and sci-fi horror. the amount of horror films where the plot is held together by a fucking sieve, but there's lots of cool deaths and the baddie is scary. And that's what's more important in a horror film, or particularly a low budget, cheap ass 80s or 90s horror film. I think you are expecting a sci-fi plot in what is essentially a horror.
Yeah. I would take that on board, yeah, absolutely.
I imagine a lot of the kills and the scares and stuff were King. That stuff was maybe largely unchanged, because I think if you ask King about this episode, he'd just be like, well, it was scary. So
yeah,
he was not trying to think of the pathology behind this doll. He was just trying to make a scary doll.
Fair. We've talked about the last scene, but then there is the proper, wonderful, beautiful homage to Chucky. For you, Kurt, basically at the end of a Chucky film, Chucky keeps recovering and coming back for one more go. It became almost a catchphrase of his, I always come back. And this is an evil doll. She gets defeated and then she comes back. It's clearly homage to Chucky. And I'm all for it because I love dolls. I assume there wasn't a sequel to this. This character, this evil doll, never came back.
No, only in the museum when I went to the X-Fest festival where they had the burnt doll actually in a case, and Laurie Musser, who I said was there, managed to rehold the doll again, which was quite a good moment. But yeah, I mean, again, going back to like saying coming back, X-Files, that is the one thing that X-Files does do a lot of. There's a one called Die Hand de Valettes, where there's a teacher that comes in, played by Susan Blommermart. She plays like potentially the devil as a teacher, and she just and it's written by Glenn Morgan, and I think it's Glenn Morgan that writes it. And on the board at the end of it, it goes, "Thank you, we might meet again," or something like that. You know, it was fun while we lasted, and it leaves you with that open-ended You know what I mean? Tombs did the same on the first episode that Tombs did. X-Files is renowned for leaving open-ended stuff. You know, just let you leave in the ether. In X-Files world, that's not really a thing either, that you would expect that kind of thing of, the dolls come back. It was an effective death though, with the hook through on the boat with the original dad. And you mentioned about Chucky being like sort of burnt, and obviously this one gets chucked into a microwave. That was the only thing I was a bit frustrated with, was Scully going, just rip the doll out of the bloody hand of that kid. Just do it. Give me the doll. Meanwhile, someone's smacking their head with a hammer. It's like, just give it the doll, just rip it out of her hands and put it in. And then she goes down really slowly. I'm like, just like, can you run, please, or do something? Just like, I'm going to put it in the microwave. Now press it. There you go.
Yeah, it was a very weird conclusion. Both of them go downstairs to deal with the doll, which in two cases is crazy, because one, that woman is just bashing herself in the head. I feel like the sheriff could just go over and just stop her to do something. But then the other one,
cushion in the way.
But then the other one is the girl is still up there. That seems dangerous to leave her with the mother and the hammer, because that's the other thing about the unresolved nature of this, is that scene of like the dead cop and her smashing herself in the head, the gasoline everywhere. Sure, they'll write up that this FBI lady came in and put a doll in the microwave, but it really looks like the mother did all this, and they don't answer that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in true X-Files fashion, what they might have done in the past is maybe that she got arrested, was in jail or something like that, and they would just leave her, just like fall back and have her just be vilified for something she hasn't done, maybe. And leave it that way. But that'll be quite a melancholy ending. They've done that a couple of times, not massively, but it just leaves it. I mean, X-Files does that a lot. They just leave things unopened like that. So it's
not dissimilar from the Chucky franchise. We get that in quite a few of the sequels. In the first one, it's a mother defending her child from Chucky. She's not in the second one, and it's just a throwaway line of dialogue where they were like, yeah, she told the courts that the doll was alive, so they put her in a psych ward. That happens to a number of characters in the Chucky franchise, where they'll survive Chucky at the end, but then it just looks like they went crazy, so they get the punishment.
What do you mean they don't get a Linda Hamilton Terminator 2 kind of rebirth?
We never got that. We never did get that.
That's a shame.
There's a horror trope as well. The well-meaning protagonist who does very suspicious things. When she got really nervous on that road because the doll started talking, so she spins the car around. No. And then to everyone else, it just looks like she almost murdered a guy by running him over.
Do you know what? I really enjoyed this episode. I spotted most of the flaws, but Kurt, you've added some more to it. I think as a horror fan, as almost like an anthology episode, regardless of it being the X-Files. If you just kind of like take a step back and it's like two detectives who happen to be the X-Files guys, I think this is fun. I think it's a really watchable thing.
So do you think it would be something that someone who hasn't watched the X-Files at all would enjoy?
Yes, I think it's an easy watch. I think pretty much everyone, unless you're like under 15, knows what the dynamic of the X-Files is. I think this is an easy access episode.
I mean, there's so many episodes. If I was trying to get somebody into the X-Files, I'd show them a different episode.
Yeah.
Because it's not the conventional Mulder-Scully dynamic. And it doesn't have other characters like Skinner and stuff, so it doesn't really give you a good idea of the world of X-Files. I mean, yeah, it's a fun enough episode by itself. If someone wanted just like, if they're doing something like this, like watching TV shows for doll-centric episodes, then it's not bad. No, yeah, it's fun. Even if they didn't know the characters, they would still get a laugh out of some of the phone scenes and stuff. It's good comedy.
So is there anything else that either of you wanted to mention that we haven't gone through in this?
Yes. Larry Musser, as I say, when I interviewed him, he was specifically asked about the lobster.
Okay, good.
The lobster was flown in from the East Coast to the West Coast for this. It was a massive lobster because they don't get that size over on that side of the country, apparently. So it was flown in particularly, and then there was a smaller version that they actually used as well. They couldn't eat it, although he did have a couple of bites in a sandwich because it was long after it being cooked.
Oh, yeah.
So there's no plastic props at all. It was just that. And Larry Musser himself was suffering from blood clots in his legs at the time, so he was struggling a little bit with his movement. And he looks a little bit bigger than what he used to be because he was struggling with that at that time. But that's and the oh yeah kind of stuff that they say. I think that's a typical Stephen King thing to do on that kind of main style, marine style way of speaking. They had to kind of do that. But yeah, those are the two main things. Larry also wanted to play the character a bit more Stephen King-esque. He wanted to be a bit more quirky than it actually was, but he was told by some of the production staff, just play it straight. It's not just a Stephen King story. It's actually being manipulated by several people, including Chris Carter. So that's another thing, is like the quirkiness of like Stephen King. There's as you say, the woman is kind of like a little bit quirky, isn't she? There is quirks to it, but it's not full-on Stephen King quirk.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, I'd say, I mean, as good as Kim Manners is as a director, he's done some amazing episodes. Yeah, I think maybe it's a little bit of a missed appeal with the, it's the Stephen King episode of the X-Files. It's not really more horror than any other episode of X-Files, really, is it?
No, I mean, it's often looked at, a lot of people like the Mulder and Scully dynamic. A lot of people I've said, it's almost like you've got all the tools in the toolbox, but because it's not a Stephen King thing and it's not really an X-File thing, it's a little bit of a dilutedness on each, that everyone's compromised to a point where it's not a terrible episode. It's actually quite a good episode. I enjoy watching it. It's not an episode I put on all the time. It's a middle-of-the-road 45 minutes of television. A middle-of-the-road X-Files is a great episode of television.
Yeah.
I think that's probably fair. So, Kurt, I've had a lovely time having you on my other podcast. Everybody knows you do Shipwrecked and COMATOSE with me at the Dwarf Pod, but where else can they find Kurt North on the internet?
Find me on Linktree, so linktr.ee/r/Muldrake. That's RMULDRAKE, which is an X-Files reference, and it is in relation to the Larry Musser episode I talked about with Kim Manners as Detective Manners. So there's a reference there. That's where that's come from. But yeah, R. Muldrake is where you generally find me on most of the social medias.
Dev, where can people find you?
At Absolute Travesty on Twitter. I have got some written reviews coming out on Frame Rated. It's October, so I'll be covering horror. I usually do.
If you're looking for me, it's at Mark Adams HC on Twitter and Instagram. And it's not Twitter anymore, it's X. I'm never going to call it X. Fuck X. The amount of times I've been looking for the little blue birdie.
Only X we care about is X-Files.
Exactly.
Indeed. So thank you very much for listening to another episode of ChuckyVision. And until next time, wanna play? Actually, I've changed my mind.
Do the Chinga one.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah.
And until next time, I want to play.
ChuckyVision is a podcast brought to you by the We Made This Network. Follow us on Twitter at ChuckyVision. Follow the network on Twitter at WMT_network. Our website is wemadethisnetwork.com. The logo was designed by Carl Bryan, and the theme tune composed by Dark Fantasy Studios. Wanna play?
Do you believe in the existence of X-Files podcasts? Then the truth is in here. I'm Tony.
I'm Sarah.
I'm Carl.
And I'm Armoldrake.
And the X-Cast is devoted to all things X-Files, such as in-depth episode discussions.
I love the 8th season being like, no, you're saying goodbye. And that's something pop culture doesn't do enough.
Interviews with many of the cast and crew from the show.
I had to audition repeatedly. I mean, I went in, I read for Chris and Frank. First I read for the casting director, Rick. And then I made it past that hurdle and read for Chris and Frank. Had a lovely meeting with them.
And special roundtable chats, commentaries, and fun bonus episodes.
But this is great. Mulder just having no idea what's going on.
On this beautiful boat with people not really speaking English.
You can find us on the We Made This podcast network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all good podcast players.
We'll see you in the basement. But until then...
Trust.
No.
One. Shipwrecked and Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast, was created and produced by Mark Adams and Kurt North. You can find us on Twitter at Red Dwarf Pod, and we are part of the We Made This podcast network.